Hello and welcome to our first ever virtual winter workshop. My name is Jeff Titchell and I'm here today at James Osler Boats in beautiful Port Carling area of Ontario, Canada. James is going to run us through a few woodworking tips that may help you in the restoration of your vintage boat.
So we're going to talk about various parts of the boat and what each part of what they're called. So here we've got the aluminum cutwater, the stem, and we got chine, main frame to intermediate frame, to hull side planking, to ribs, which are just a nailer to help hold the hull side planks together. Then we got the keel, which is joined to the stem, which is also through bolted to every frame through the gussets that are bolted holding the two frames together. Alright, so then we've got the stringers, which can also be called engine beds as well, that span from the bow right to the stern, and they're connected to each frame as well. Alright, so here we've got the transom frame, which is also fastened into the keel as well. And it's all tied in through the hull sides, through the transom board. And that's about it. Alright, so if you're in the market for a wood boat, I would definitely recommend you hire a boat builder or a marine surveyor to do a hull survey on the boat. That way they'll be able to find any issues, and what issues they do find might be able to help you in negotiation of price. So with this boat, it originally came in for a new transom because the framework had rotted out, and a couple hull side planks that are tied into the transom, as you can see, were rotten. But as we continue to pull material away, this whole area of the boat sort of fell apart, which turned into, we had to pull the bottom planking off, which was a good thing because the motor leaked oil severely, which damaged the bottom planking, made it soft, and also damaged the rest of the framework, making it soft as well, which has now led to this being a restoration instead of a repair. So we've gotten a couple questions regarding double bottoms, so here's one. And right now we've got the inner skin, as it's called, installed and 2 coats of sealer put on. So what we've done is we've milled mahogany to 1/4 inch thickness and laid it on a diagonal pattern. That helps without having to steam the wood to get the twists happening. And then we've got this green filler, which is just filler to cover the screw heads we've used to fasten it down. And you'll notice the pencil lines are there to just tell us where the frameworks are, so when we're installing the outer planking, we know where to put the screws. And the outer planking will be going this way instead of this way. And they'll each be, it'll be about 6 rounds per side to fill over. Alright, so we got a couple questions on how to join a board together. So here's one example of a smooth skin hull side where the joint is just butted to the next plank with the butt block behind. So you can fasten the planks to the butt block, which hold it together. Also, with this style, you don't want to have a joint here and right underneath it. You need them staggered to give it strength, just like a brick wall. Alright, so we've had some questions regarding varnish and the application of varnish. So for the first, Epifanis, they offer 2 products, the standard varnish and then a so-called non-sand varnish, where you don't have to sand in between coats, but they still recommend that you scuff the surface in it after you apply about 5 coats of that, you're gonna have to let it sit for probably up to a week to let it harden up, and then do a major hard sand. So not too sure on how much time you actually save with it compared to normal varnish where you have to sand every coat, and as the coats progress, the sanding gets tougher and tougher to get it down to that flat surface you're looking for. Lap streak interiors, I would say that's where you'd want to sort of use the non-sand, because you can speed up that process of application. And then yeah, that's about it. So then we got brushes, where the most common is badger hair brushes, which are expensive, so you want to maintain the brush. After every use, you want to clean it with a thinner and then put it into a linseed oil, or I use motor oil just because it doesn't dry up or anything. It stays wet. And then after that, when you go back to use, you need to thoroughly clean the brush again to get all that oily residue out of the brush, and then repeat. Alright, so here's a couple brushes. So right here is a nice badger hair brush from Lee Valley. They run about 80 bucks on it. And then we've got another one as well here. And then we use a paintbrush spinner after we put it through the thinners, and that helps guarantee that we've gotten all that stuff out of the brush bristles.
Hello and welcome to the ACBS-Toronto first ever virtual winter workshop. My name is Jeff Titchell, and today we're going to start by trying to answer some of the questions that have been posed from our members in regards to restoring their vintage boats. Okay, so one of the questions that I get quite often is, how do I know if my engine is 6 volt or 12 volt? And how do I know if it's positive ground or negative ground? So let's start with something fairly simple at the beginning here. The first thing that I would suggest looking at if you're unsure if you're 6 volt positive or negative ground is to start right here at the battery. So the easiest way to tell right off the bat is if your positive battery terminal comes off the battery on the plus side, and if it goes to a ground somewhere on the engine, that means the positive is going to the ground. That makes it 6 volt positive ground. If the positive cable goes from the positive on the battery to the starter solenoid, then it is 12 volt or 6 volt negative ground. In other words, the positive goes to the solenoid, the negative goes to ground. That would be your quickest and easiest way to tell. The other way you can tell is to look at your wiring on your ignition coil. If it's a positive ground situation, then the plus on the end of the coil, and they are marked positive and negative, the positive side will go to the distributor and the power will be coming in on the negative side. If it's a traditional negative ground system, the power will come in on the plus and the negative will go to the distributor to the points, and that's what grounds the points out to make the ignition fire. So that's a good start for anybody who's trying to figure out if you're positive or negative ground. An indicator you can use to see if your system is running positive or negative ground is to actually start with the positive terminal of the battery and follow the cable. And if it goes to the ground or to a bolt on your engine, it'll be a positive ground system. If the positive wire goes from the positive terminal on the battery to the starter solenoid on the starter, then it is a negative ground system. Now, 6 volt to 12 volt systems. They can be a little harder to determine, but we're going to give you some pointers to help you out. The first one is going to be quick and simple. If your engine has an alternator, which looks like this here, then your system will be 12 volt. This is the later version of the charging systems on marine engines, and therefore it was in the 12 volt era. So this makes it simple. If you see this unit here, an alternator on your engine, you are running 12 volts. Now, on your earlier engines, like these two here, this old Buchanan and this Chrysler M7 Crown, it's a little bit harder to determine sometimes if they're 6 or 12 volt systems. One of the ways you can do it is to actually look, and it'll be hard to see on the image, but on the starter, for example, there is an information plate quite often, and you sometimes will find those stamped 6V or 12V, which for obvious information is 6 volt or 12 volt. Sometimes they have been converted from 6 volt to 12 volt, and you'll get a system like this generator here, and that generator, quite often if a starter and alternator rebuilder has rebuilt that and converted it from 6 volt to 12 volt, which is done internally with field coils and armatures, they will mark the outside of it with a stamping to say it is now 12 volt. So sometimes by visually inspecting the components, whether it's the starter or the generator, and same on this unit, you can tell. One of the good examples on this one here is this was completely rebuilt before we installed it on the engine, and the starter solenoid, this chrome piece on it, is stamped right on it 12 volt. So it gives you a distinct indication that it has been converted. The other thing that you can do is look on the ignition coil. Ignition coils are indicated whether they're 6 or 12 volt. For example, I have a 6 volt and a 12 volt coil here, and they're stamped right on them so you know what they are. And we'll show you a photograph of those up close. That's a good indication as to what path you're on, 6 volt or 12 volt. This M7 Chrysler Crown started its life as a 6 volt negative ground system, but the starter and the generator were updated to 12 volts, as you can see from the starter solenoid, which is marked 12 volts. It's hard to see in the back of this image, but often when they convert a generator from 6 volt to 12 volt, the rebuilder will stamp it 12 volts so that people know that it has been updated. One of the questions that I get asked quite often is, can I convert my 6 volt system to 12 volts? And do I think it's a wise investment or a good idea? I think that it is probably an upgrade and worth the investment. However, you will need a qualified starter or alternator rebuilder to convert your starter and generator to 12 volts. You'll also have to convert your coil, and in some relations there might be a voltage regulator also in the mix. Why I think it's a good idea is parts availability will then become easier for you in the future. The 6 volt system went out in the early 60s with the automotive world, so therefore it's getting extremely old and people are not carrying it nearly as much at our local parts stores. It's getting harder to find the parts. 12 volt batteries are definitely more economical to purchase than 6 volt batteries, and I do believe you gain some advantage in cranking power and starting your engine. So I do see a lot of advantages, but it will cost you money to do such, and you will need a qualified starter or alternator rebuilder to get that process completed. One of the other things that I often get asked along that lines is, where do I go for this? A lot of times you can go through your local jobber store where you get your parts, or if you look it up nowadays with the internet, you should be able to find, like I said, a qualified starter or alternator rebuilder in your area. It is something that that they do see. It's getting a little bit harder to find some of the pieces like the rest of the world when it comes to parts, but it is something that is definitely a possibility, and I do think that it'll bring added value to your boating enjoyment.
Hi, I'm Mike Gridley and welcome to my boat shop. I'm just about to start a pretty involved restoration project here. The subject boat, of course, is a 1972 Checkmate MX-15 classic old ski boat. Now this is going to be a complete restoration. This boat has sat outside for some years and the structure is fully rotten. So it's a full deck off, all of the wood structure out, transom cut out of it, and a full rebuild, fiberglass job, and of course the final refinishing. And we're going to follow this project through to its completion. Well, I've been kind of busy in the shop the last few days. Had a lot going on. Been able to get the old motor, which was seized, off the boat, taken apart, and sent in for scrap to be recycled. Also been able to build a set of dollies out of wood and some other construction components to roll this around the shop, make it more stable, get it off that old trailer that it was on. So the next step is to get the rub rail off the boat, pop all the rivets so we can pull the deck off, and then start the restoration. Now it takes a bit of time to get the rub rail off of this boat. Absolutely amazed how many rivets they just had in the rub rail. That and being over 40 years old, trying to pry the rub rail off and release all of that old marine silicone underneath took a bit of time. Next task was, of course, to get all of the rivets that were holding the deck to the hull. Quite a few as well here, and you have to be careful not to damage the fiberglass and poke away and push the rivets out. And what you've got left is an awful lot of holes in the deck and in the hull that are going to have to be repaired so they're strong enough, that area, so when you rivet the hull back together with the deck, there's going to be something to grip to. Now to get the deck off, had to carefully work around and cut the sealant that was bonding the deck to the hull, and using a variety of screwdrivers and pry bars and scrapers, carefully pry the hull off without cracking the glass, and put some wood supports under it. And when that was off, it would be set aside to be worked on later. I'm almost ready to get started on one of the last parts of the teardown with the old hull here before we can start working on it to build the boat back up. And of course that's cutting the inner skin out of the old transom here, because certainly it's rotten enough and it does need to be torn out. But I am going to leave the outer skin, even though it's in pretty bad shape, but that gives us some structure to work with to keep the boat together. And of course, when we're putting the new transom back into the boat. So time to suit up with some safety gear and get going. Cutting the inner fiberglass skin from the transom is certainly messy. Fortunately, don't have to be delicate because the transom is rotted right out of this particular boat. And what I'm using here is a masonry cutoff wheel on a grinder, and working slowly and carefully and wearing gloves and all the safety gear and keeping the fingers out of the way. With the skin cut all the way through, it was quite easy to pull it apart using a pry bar, because as you can see, this boat had been sitting outside wet for a long time, and the plywood transom had pretty much turned to complete mush.
Well, that's the messy part done with getting the transom out. There's lots of cleanup to do, lots of grinding to do to get ready to put a new one back in, but there's some other things we have to work on as well. Now, most of the boats are just like this MX-15, this Checkmate. They have a core in the hull for strength. This doesn't have it in the sides, fortunately, but it does have a core in the hull. Now, one of the things you're worried about is, given all the water damage in the transom on this boat, is it going to have that level in the hull? And it does. There's no doubt about it. So what you have to do is sound solid, that all the layers are together and there's no rot going on. You can also use a moisture meter, but this tells the story pretty quickly. Solid, punky. You can see it move. So what I have to do is sound out the area. We're going to have to cut the inner fiberglass liner on the floor, chisel out the core and replace it, and obviously lay new glass. Big question mark here, probably. Absolutely. This is going to have to go, for starters.
Again, using the cutoff wheel, the inner skin has to be cut from the hull. Now you have to be really careful. It'd be quite easy to slip, cut through that, cut through the balsa wood, and damage the outer skin on the hull. And that's the one thing you want to protect. You don't want to have to be repairing that. So very carefully work around the area and remove the skin. And unfortunately, even though the balsa core was rotten, it still was bonded down in some areas, and it took some time using a chisel and pry bars and a Bosch oscillating tool to get in underneath it and scrape everything out. It's a slow job, but it's necessary if the hull's ever going to have any strength again. With the rotten core removed from the boat, the next step was to start cleaning up the transom, using a chisel and other scrapers to remove shards of plywood and everything still bonded to the outer skin. It's amazing that anything stayed stuck, but that was the case. It took a while to get all the loose pieces off. Then of course the inside of the transom had to be ground with the grinder, and of course the entire interior of the boat was treated to the same detailed grinding to smooth and flush everything, ready to lay in the core and the new fiberglass mat. I'm glad that is behind us. That was one big mess. The amount of time it took to grind everything out of the interior, plus clean the shop up, was a lot longer than I thought it was going to be. I think I spent more time cleaning than I actually did doing the grinding. Now, we've cleaned the boat out with soap and water. We'll clean it again before we lay any resin into the boat with MEK or acetone. But what we're going to start next is to put the core back in and rebuild the first part of the hull. Well, that wraps up part one of the restoration of this 1972 Checkmate MX-15. As you can see, a lot of work's been done from what you just saw in the video, but we are planning on having more workshop videos online with ACBS-Toronto. We hope you've enjoyed our first virtual video winter workshop, and we'll have more workshops to come. So check in at the website at acbs.ca on a regular basis and see what's new in the world of video and virtual events.